Good afternoon. This is Dr. Craig Stern of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and ProData Analytics. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you at the beginning of the year. I'd like to wish everybody a happy, a healthy, and hopefully a peaceful new year. I hope it's a good year for you and that you had a great holiday season. I want to talk today about uncertainty. One of the things that's going on today, whether it's financial markets, healthcare markets, or otherwise, is uncertainty about what happens both in the new year, what happens with new administrations, what happens with new congressional kinds of things, etc. And while I don't want to talk about politics necessarily, as uncertainty is a problem in the financial markets where they don't know whether they're going to make money or lose money because they add more risk into the marketplace, the same thing is true in healthcare. Healthcare has the problem that it sets on a given course. It's dealing with certain issues with regard to how it's being paid, and yet when things change, it creates a lot of uncertainty. So the question for us is, how do we look at this, and what are the areas that need to be addressed? And certainly as analysts, we also are interested in how does this whole thing work for us? Well, one of the things that we want to know here is what areas are impacted when we deal with uncertainty. Clearly, pricing and payments are a huge problem, but then so is this whole issue of transparency that has been talked about at length but isn't quite clear what everybody's talking about. Has to do with pricing, clearly. It has to deal with services that are being offered, etc., and also quality. How is quality being measured? So I'd like to focus on those for a moment in order to address this. The first issue that we have in uncertainty is what services are being covered and what services are not being covered. This is not a discussion of whether the Affordable Care Act is repealed or it's not repealed or whatever goes on politically. It's an issue of what are the services that people are supposed to deliver so that they know what is it that they're going to deliver and that people are going to be expecting, and they're part of whatever healthcare benefits they are, public or private, and what's going to be excluded. These are very important issues. Clearly, with the Affordable Care Act, pardon me, clearly with the Affordable Care Act, there's been issues where there's essential benefits that people have to provide, but they're pretty standard. So the question is how are they going to be addressed? And that is one area of uncertainty for us as we address things. The second issue, of course, is pricing. We have the issue that probably an estimated 80% of all physician practices are now owned by hospitals or hospital-type corporations. As a result of that, we have the hospital corporations making decisions about how these people are going to be paid, whether they're going to be paid on things that are covered by a benefit, such as FDA-covered things with regard to drugs, issues with regard to benefits that are more discretionary, so they would be things like over-the-counter drugs or discretionary issues with regard to weight loss or smoking cessation or things like that, what's going to be involved and what's going to be included in a standard benefit and what isn't. 20 years ago, people spent more time on a history of healthcare and what were the symptoms. Today, more and more of it takes a short history and deals with laboratory tests in order to address what the problems are. So you need to know what is being covered so that you have a better idea of knowing what it is that is going to be paid for, what is the person going to be paying for, and then it changes the communication dynamic because people are going to be asking, well, why do I need this, and do I have to pay for it, and is there really a need that I have to have it, or are you just doing it in order to try and cover all bases, whatever that issue is. Part of this, of course, has to deal with contracts. It has to deal with health plan, insurance, and then also government, Medicare and Medicaid kind of contracts with providers, whether it's hospitals, patients, pharmacies, or otherwise. And those contracts are critical, and they change in a general way either yearly or every 3 years. And clearly in an area of uncertainty, then there's a need to address whether things need to be changed in these contracts in order to give people a better understanding of what they're going to have and more of what people are going to pay for. In an area where the costs of hospital stays, the costs due to people spending more time in the intensive care units versus on the general floor, because they're sicker people, and those are the ones that are being sent to hospitals. Issues where there's expensive specialty medications, and these specialty drugs are going to cost more, so that people are forced to pay more of the bill and now have to decide, how am I going to pay for it? Am I going to finance it? Am I going to be able to pay for it? Can I pay it out? Or what kind of additional subsidies or others can I get in order to lower the cost? Those kind of issues are critical in order to try and understand who is going to pay for what, and then the kind of questions, and once again, the dynamic of who's going to address, do I really need this? Is there a cheaper alternative? How do I go about finding out what my alternatives are and who can give me some relief, whether it's a subsidy or some other thing? I clearly want to know what those are. The other part of this is a quality argument, and the quality argument is frankly much more complicated than even the pricing argument. The quality argument has moved, especially with regard to what originally started with Medicare, then had some changes with regard to some of the state Medicaid programs, but in the Affordable Care Act, it moved to volume to value. It wasn't that I was getting paid for every service that I delivered or every drug that I delivered, but what was the value of them? Did I actually have a benefit? Was there a decrease in blood pressure when I was taking blood pressure meds? Was there a decrease in my blood sugar when I was taking diabetes drugs, etc.? And the question here is that in general, the marketplace moved towards volume to value. If we begin to change that dynamic, then it means that something that has already started and that the train has already left the station is already moving, and people are looking at that and are saying, well, wait a minute, if I'm moving to value, how am I going to address that? What kind of metrics am I using? Am I still going to use the same metrics that I was looking at, whether they're national metrics like NCQA and HEDIS, or whether they're URAC guidelines, or whether they're JCO guidelines for hospitals? What metrics am I going to use? And then more importantly, once again, how will we pay for it? Because in general, the volume to value took us from an individual doing individual services to groups of people doing services, and those groups of people with the physician at the helm as the ringleader, as the chairman of that group, had nurses and pharmacists and laboratory and physical therapists and everybody else involved in this in order to deal with it. So it changed the dynamic, and we're moving to that dynamic. Now the question is what happens to it. And finally is this whole this whole issue of uncertainty. Uncertainty adds variability in effectiveness, but also adds variability in cost, both of which drive up cost and drive up poor care. By that I mean the following. If quality is predicated on a particular set of standards, then the greater deviation from those standards is in effect a greater deviation and less standard of care. So it is absolutely necessary to identify where is the uncertainty, can we reduce the uncertainty, and therefore reduce the difference between the standard of care and what is actually happening so that we can minimize that difference. Similarly, from a cost standpoint, if you have a lot of uncertainty, there's a greater amount of risk, and you're going to potentially pay more not knowing what the right rules are. So the more that you can decrease that delta between what is supposed to be payment, what is supposed to be reimbursement versus what is actually happening, the more that you can reduce that, then the better off we are and the less cost that uncertainty provides. As you can see, quality and cost tend to work in tandem here, where if you're decreasing one, you're also improving the other. If you decrease the delta between what is required and what is actually happening, then you're also decreasing the delta in cost, and that also decreases overall a significant amount of care. Over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about many other issues, but I wanted to bring up uncertainty right away because it seems to be the name of the game and underlying many of the discussions that we're having, so I want to address that. I want to have you and invite you to come to our websites. We do pharmacy benefit news every 2 weeks, and it's available to people for free so that you can read about what's going on in particular areas. Also go to www.propharmaconsultants.com /rxinfox.html, and we have a daily news feed where we're picking up in several different areas just to bring all the information together for free so that you've got it. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of week. Happy New Year, and I look forward to talking to you again.